What's up, guys? Elon Moose, and in today's video, I'm going to be going over the $100 million e-commerce playbook for 2026, bringing out my inner Alex Hormozy with this $100 million title. But reason why I feel qualified to be able to speak about this is, first off, I run a portfolio of e-commerce brands that are pacing well above 9 figures a year in sales for 2026, with multiple brands within our portfolio pacing to do over $100 million individually within the portfolio. So that's just on the brands that me and my partners are actively managing and running internally. And then secondary, I also am doing one-on-one high-level consulting with clients combined that are doing over $65 million per month in sales. So pacing out well above $100 million, $780 million per year from just the clients that we're running. So first off, I have my own active brands that will do hopefully well above that by earlier in this year. And then secondary, again, like I have these clients. So I have a pretty unique perspective within the brands that we're running in the limited niche that we have within our own portfolio, but then also across a wide variety of niche with, from these brands, individual brands that are also well above $100 million a year. So multiple 9-figure brands individually, and then a whole cluster of brands that are bringing us to $780 million a year just from the brands we're consulting with. With all that being said, I have a pretty unique perspective for this year between our internal brands, between stuff that I'm consulting with our clients to also work on for the things that I think will work across the board for high scale e-commerce. So this is not beginners content. This is for people that are already doing ideally at least $100,000 per month and even more than that, where I think this will be most applicable for you. So with that being said, let's jump right into the strategy, starting from point number 1, which is a subscription program. Now, this, I'm not going to say it's a must-have for 2026, but I think it will just make your life way easier if it's something that actually makes logical sense to have. So it's not having the subscription program for the sake of having it, but if you're selling some form of a consumable-based product, even if it's in the beauty niche, a lot of times that can segue into a pretty good subscription program. If you're selling something in the health space that has a logical segue, then this is where it can make sense if you don't have one. And then if you do have one, it's about figuring out how to optimize the right levers to make this as efficient as possible. And the reason why I start with this point is because for our strategy internally and with our clients' brands, this is the whole foundation of what makes everything else work, because there's a few main components. And again, I don't want to go over this in detail because if you want to learn more about this, you can check out other videos on my channel where I go way more into depth on this. But just to go over this at a high level so you can understand what are the different levers over here, we have the main ones on the front end, which is going to be your opt-in rate. So the amount of new customers that buy from you, what percentage of them are actually opting into the subscription program. We have the AOV. So this is front-end AOV, but then also subscription AOV, meaning the amount that you're charging customers on each rebill. And then third, you have cadence. So what is the amount that you're rebilling from a monthly basis? Is it every 30 days? Is it every 60 days? Is it every 90 days? Which could be different depending on the program you're trying to build. And then on the other side of it, like the main ones that I want to just touch on is month 1, month 2, and then month 3. These ones are the important ones to note on for your subscription program because this makes up your first 90 days. And when we talk about really optimizing the subscription program, there's a lot of other things, like we can talk about general LTV, 12-month LTV, different things like that. But for the sake of what I want to talk about right now, it's not going to be these. It's going to be the first 90 days because these are the numbers that if one of these are lower, we're going to try to optimize something here, whether it's in one of these first 3 months, whether it's something directly on the front end, whether it's a combination of everything to try to maximize the subscription program to the point of maximum efficiency so that we can scale as hard as possible. And the reason why we look at all of these as our basis is because within the first 90 days, this is what's going to determine our CAC. This will determine our target, right? Where in one example, let's just say our product costs $50 for the sake of this example. And let's say that you're trying to optimize for a $25 CAC on a $50 purchase because you don't have a subscription program, or you don't have an optimized subscription program, or you just don't understand how to read the numbers within your program. It can be for any of those reasons typically, right? Now, let's say you do add a subscription program and you do optimize a lot of these levers. What can happen, obviously not going into all the details of what these numbers look like, but in theory, the way you should think about this is your CAC on the front end. Because in this scenario, let's just say that your goal is that within 90 days, you don't care at what point in it, but you want to get to a point where you're like getting to at least 20% net profit within the 90 days, right? So if this is then what this could mean is that when you optimize all these levers, once you look at all these numbers again, you might be able to scale at a $50 CAC to still get to that 20% net profit within 90 days. You're not going to do it now on day one, but you're going to do it still within that 90 days. And sometimes it can be even more than that. Sometimes this can go all the way up to maybe $75 CAC, and your front end AOV doesn't change. It still can be $50, but you just can now afford to spend sometimes triple the amount of what you were targeting to spend before because you have this subscription program in place. So when I look at the strategy for 2026, at least for our internal brands, again, there's a lot of brands that don't need a subscription, especially if you're in fashion or especially if you're in one-off products. A lot of the times you could look at this basis of just trying to improve your AOV, but I think it's a little bit easier when you look at this from a 90-day LTV standpoint to try to optimize those different numbers. So for our strategy, at least, we're looking at this as the whole foundation, trying to optimize whether it's the front end levers, which are these numbers over here, or the back end levers, or I guess just general levers, which is just your subscription program as a whole, which will dictate your general LTV per customer that you're bringing in. But this is the foundation of everything else, because this is the thing that is not, we're not talking about lowering your CAC by $5, $10, 10%, 20%. This is something that literally can allow you to triple the amount that you're willing to spend on a customer in the first place, right? So everything falls down from the tree from here. It's the big domino that if you knock this down, it just makes everything else in your business model way easier. This is the first thing that within our internal brands, we've already spent a ton of time optimizing and are always going to be meticulously optimizing this further and further. So this is number one. Now, number two, assuming that you have this in place and then optimized, the second thing is your creatives machine. So the creatives machine, let's go into this from a few different layers. Number one is you need to have a way to make quality ads. So we'll use this as just the first Q. There's two Qs that we got to look at, which is quality and quantity. So what are ways that we can look at making quality ads? The first way to actually assess if you're making good ads or not making good ads is you need a proper way to track your ads. So when you're tracking your ads, what you need to be tracking is hit rate. Hit rate is the most important metric to understanding the success of your ad. And by the way, hit rate, it's also a pretty vague term, right? Because if I go to 3 different brand owners, they probably have 3 different ways that they're looking at their hit rate. So there's probably a centralized way that you want to be having to look at your hit rate. So for us, for example, we look at hit rate from 3 different perspectives. One is we look at hit rate on a week-to-week perspective. So hit rate will always be determined on paired metrics. So one of those metrics is always going to be spend. The other metric will be either CAC and ROAS, something like that. So let's just use CAC for the sake of this example as our target. Again, let's go back from whatever we were saying over here, where let's say our target CAC is $50. So let's say this is the target. On a week basis, we probably won't have that many creatives that spend the amount that we want to spend. But as a minimum, we might say we want to have at least $250 in spend. So at least it's spending something that's worth looking at, right? So on a week basis, we're looking at how many reach our target CAC within the spend target within a week, and what percentage of all of the creatives that we launch get to those numbers. Now, the second thing we'll look at is on a monthly basis. Now the spend can be a little bit higher. Let's call it like at least 1,000. How many creatives spend at least 1,000 at that same target? And then the last thing that we look at will usually be within a 90-day basis, which is what we'll call real winners. This will be different depending on your brand, depending on how consistent creatives hit these types of levers. But this can be something like, let's say, any creative that spends at least 20K as a minimum. And again, this is a different ratio. We would calculate this differently depending on the brand. But now we get these 3 different tiers that all trickle down into these different spend tiers, ultimately leading to how many creatives are actually hitting what we would call a real winner, which is the ones that spend above 20K. So we're ultimately trying to optimize each stage of these to get as many creatives that can actually become winners within the quarterly basis. And the reason why I like to look at it over that extended period of time is just because it takes some time to actually breed real winners, right? So that's how we look at it internally. You might have a different way that how you look at it, but I think it's a pretty good centralized way to look at it. Now that's on the quality. Now let's look at the second thing is, okay, first off on this, right? Now we could go into a lot of different ways. Maybe it's the research process. Maybe it's the scripting process. That's the problem if you're not getting to the hit rates that you want. But the thing is, usually within any creative team, there's going to be one person that's making better creatives than other people on the team. And maybe it's you directly. Maybe it's your lead creative strategist. If you have multiple creative strategists, there's usually going to be one that's the main performer. So when you look at tracking, has to go further than just a general basis, but you also need to be tracking hit rate per strategist or hit rate per editor, right? So it's really important to get these metrics centralized between all the different positions on the team. And then once you understand what that is, you want to start to extract the knowledge from that core person on your team, create proper trainings around that person, so then you can properly scale to the next point, which is the second Q, which is quantity. Okay? So quantity is something that you need to have the proper trainings in place to properly scale quantity, right? Because you don't want to just scale quantity for the sake of quantity. You want to take and extract the best ways that you've made good ads, and the person that's getting the best percentages in performance over here, you want to figure out a way that you can centralize that knowledge across different strategists that you bring on your team, different people that you bring on your team. So the way that you can do this is there's a lot of different ways. One good example is just have that person start recording looms as they're going through their creatives workflow, whether they're doing research or scripting different stuff out, and then create a centralized and standardized training process so that when you bring in new strategists, they go through what this person is doing. You also give them one-on-one time with that best person so that they can actually properly learn how to make creatives in a way that's working currently for your business. And something to think about with creatives specifically is that every brand will have kind of their core format or their core style that works. And most of the time, there's not going to be any two brands that have this exactly the same. There's always going to be some unique twist to that format or spice or thing that they can rely on from a creative standpoint that just consistently works in their account that won't work in another account. And there's a lot of variables as to why that might be the case. The biggest thing that you need to understand when you bring in a strategist is that, especially if you're bringing in a strategist from another brand that's already at high scale, and they have their own process that's working, that process, especially initially, is not going to be the same as the core essence and the core ingredients that work within your brand. And maybe it's not a format, maybe it's just a way that you present information in a specific way or a specific breakdown of how you explain things, or maybe it's the visual style that you consistently use within your ads. There's a lot of different micro components of that might be why your core brand is working and it won't work in another brand. So the biggest mistake I see people do is they'll bring in a new creative strategist and expect that to be the main way that they scale quantity. Whereas in reality, they don't understand the core thing that's actively working in your brand. So that's why it's really important that you first have this training so that they can understand what is that core essence, be up to speed, and then spend a good portion of their time just trying to mimic and replicate that. Like at least 50% of their time in the beginning should be trying to take the formats that are already working and the styles that are already working and trying to do it in their own way to make that work. And then the other percentage of their time is now they are a new brain per se in your operation, right? So if you're hiring good creative strategists, they're going to have their own strategy that's working now from another brand, that your goal is now to stack that on top of the strategies that are already working that you have, right? So the other part is the other 50% of their time can be trying to make those work. But what I found is that if they spend the time going through the training and understanding those core ingredients that have made creatives work within your business as of today, once they understand that, then they can take that knowledge and apply it into their existing formats, right? So the formats that they have working from their other brands, you want them to still try to test those, but only once you feel like they have a pretty good understanding of what's working over here. And this same analogy kind of applies for video editors, any position on the creative team. But once you have all of these pieces in place, this is where we can really talk about scaling quality, because you need to have those trainings in place first. But then the question is just reverse engineering how much quantity you need in your team. So the way that we look at this in a simple way is that we will always reverse engineer this from an ad spend standpoint. So in a simple example, let's say our ad spend we're targeting is $1 million a month in spend. What this means for us is that roughly 20% will go to creatives testing as our budget. That's what we know is our ratio. Sometimes it'll be less than that, but 20% I would say is more of a broad testing budget. So 20% will either go into testing creatives directly, maybe it's testing a portion towards new funnels, maybe it's also testing a portion to custom audiences that we still try to make. And the way that we do custom audiences, just as a little side tangent, is that we try to break down different audience pockets that we see from an age perspective, from a device perspective, and then isolate some of those variables. We still do that at a minor scale. For the most part, we do run broad, but that could be a test, for example, that we would run. So 20% of your budget, but let's say out of that 20%, it's 10% that would need to go to creatives, just for the sake of this example. Sometimes it will be more than that. So that will put you at roughly 100K that you want to test towards creatives. Now, a lot of you guys might still be doing CBOs as you're testing. I don't think it matters for the sake of what I'm going to break down here, but whatever that amount is that you're testing, you usually want to have at least 2 to sometimes 4x whatever your target AOV is as the breakdown of how you can determine how much you would call it a cutoff point for a creative or the proper budget. So let's just use like $200 as the example over here. So what that means is that we want to test at least 500 different creatives over the course of the month, if this is our cutoff point. Now, 500 creatives over the course of the month will break us down to around 125 concepts per week. And this can be a combination of images, it can be videos, right? But this would be our target if this was our spend target. Now, the key thing is you also need to pace ahead, right? So if I'm going from 1 million to 2 million at these same ratios, that would mean I actually need double that amount. It means I would need 250 creatives a week to maintain. And sometimes it might be difficult or challenging to do. You can play around with some of these ratios for your own brand. Again, this is something when we work with clients, we try to help them find the right ratio and the right way to determine how much they should be scaling their creatives and the output. But this is the number that, depending on where you're at and where you're trying to scale to, you actually have to do this in advance. So it's not based on where you're at today, it's where you're trying to get to in the next month or so or more. And a lot of times you have to plan this a little bit further in advance because you might need way more team members to actually get to those ratios you're trying to scale to. So the way that you then can start to look at this is then we want to reverse engineer this number depending on what we can sustain per team member. So if a creative strategist can sustain called 30 briefs a week and a video editor can sustain only, let's call it 15 ads a week, and obviously this is going to be different depending on each brand, then what we have to do is start to reverse engineer this. So let's pull out a calculator just for the sake of this example. So if we wanted to get to 250, we know a strategist can only do 30 briefs a week for us. What this means is, in theory, we're going to need 8 different strategists to actually be able to maintain that type of volume. And at 250 creatives a week, based on a video editor capacity, that means we would literally need, if this was purely video edits, we would need around 17 different editors to actually get to these numbers. Now, obviously, there's ways to subsidize for this. Some ways can be some AI that can do some of the additional briefs that you need. For example, if you create some automation, some processes over here, some of it rely more on graphic design. So that can help with that. And that can subsidize for some of these. So the thing is, if you don't have enough people, or you don't feel like you can scale to that amount of people, or if you just don't think it's efficient to scale to that amount of people, that's where you have to look at some creative ways. Another way is TikTok creators or organic creators that can help subsidize for some of these content gaps. But what you want is good shots on goal of high quality content that can help to subsidize to get you to these target numbers that you're actually trying to scale to. So I guess that's a really long-winded way to explain how the creatives machine works. But when I'm looking at a creatives machine, this is how we look at optimizing everything, right? So the first thing is always looking at quality. Where can we improve it? What are parts of the process that we can improve? And once we see where we can improve it, it's then looking at how can we get the proper foundation of trainings in place to create and build the machine. So that's a really in-depth example of what that looks like, but this is what you need to understand to maintain this. And the beauty of the subscription program and how these come together is the more your subscription program scales and the more MRR that you start to grow, the monthly recurring revenue, this becomes your basis of how much you can start to afford to spend on customer acquisition. And that carries over into your creatives machine targets, right? Because now your targets can continuously raise. And it's not to say that you should always raise it, but you can raise it in terms of how much you can afford to spend on customer acquisition. And based on that, it just makes what a winner creative is much easier to come by, right? Because if your target right now is, let's say, a 2 ROAS on Facebook, but once you start to understand how you can optimize all these parts, your target is called a 1 ROAS, then what that ends up meaning for you is that a winner that you would have not called a winner before, all of a sudden now becomes a winner. So it just helps with all the different parts here, but this is really what you need to sustain scale, especially on Meta as you go, is you need to have this machine in place. Now let's go into the next part, which is the funnel machine. Let me give myself some more room over here to do some nice, beautiful artwork for you guys. I know you guys love this, so let me just delete some of this and we're gonna go into this. Okay, so next point over here, guys, is funnel machine, which follows a lot of the same analogies that I just went over there for the creatives machine, right? Where I think what a lot of people don't realize is that you have a lot more leverage to be testing on the funnel side than you even understand, right? Like, especially if you're a fast growing brand and let's say you're doing above 500K monthly visitors. Reality is on 500K monthly visitors, right? Like, for the most part, this will vary depending on the type of test you're doing and obviously the consistencies of the test, how many conversions are going. But let's just use this as like an average scenario. Usually you can get by with 10,000 visitors per page on a test. So if you're doing an A/B test, what that means is you need 2 pages that will get to 10K visitors. And if you add that up, that means 20K visitors total. And now let's do the quick math on this example. Too scared to do mental math, so I'm going to do this with a calculator. So what this means is you can actually run 25 tests, right? Based on this being your example, if you have 500,000 monthly visitors and you're aiming for 20K visits per proper A/B test, it means that you have enough bandwidth to do 25 tests over the course of a month. And what I see with most of the brands is like they'll run like one test every 2 weeks or something. So like they're running like 2 tests a week when they could actually be running like up to 25. Now, again, it doesn't mean you have to run the full 25, but even running just 15 instead of 2 is a massive difference in terms of how your CVR can uplift. So the first thing is understanding what your testing capacity is, which is going through this type of process, which again comes from reverse engineering it. And then based on this, like what does your team need to look like to actually be able to run it? So usually you're going to need like a CRO strategist, someone that can come up with the different ideas, someone that can also do the project management. You might need a copywriter in there. And a lot of times a copywriter can also be one of your creative strategists, a copywriter that can help execute on those different tests. You'll need web developers to help bring those tests into motion, especially if it's like page revamps or bigger tests. You'll probably need a UX designer, at least on a freelance basis, to help you with those designs. And ideally, they can also serve as a graphic designer. And if not, you'll also need like a graphic designer separately. Now, these can vary depending on how much you're scaling, depending on the output. I'm not going to break all of these down in detail. You guys can get the same analogy that I was using from a creative standpoint, but it's the different team members in place. And what I recommend from a funnel machine is don't worry too much about the funnel machine until you feel like you have a good grasp on your creatives machine, because creatives is the more important lever here to make sure, like without creatives, you can't scale. Now, if you have good creatives and a good subscription basis, you can scale pretty aggressively. But then the next thing to really look at is how do you optimize this to a place where, one, you're doing proper split testing across the board and maximizing the amount of tests that you can run, but then also focusing a lot on pre-lander pages, because pre-lander pages are one of the biggest hacks to boosting conversion rate more than anything else. So focusing on whether it's advertorials, listicles, quiz funnels, even some different pre-lander pages that can help you just boost your overall conversion rate where it might make sense. And this, I can go into a whole different video on the strategy of this. But in terms of a playbook, I think this is how you should look at it, is like turning this and looking at both of these as their own machines. Now, each of these machines, from a creative standpoint, for example, we could talk about VSL ads versus UGC ads versus other formats of ads and go into all the tactical execution points on it. But what I want to talk about is more high-level strategy over here of like how you should be viewing it if you're the core operator of your brands, is really looking at it as a machine, and the same applies from a funnel perspective. Okay, now the next point that comes into all this is really dialing in your Amazon listing on your brand. And the reason why this is super important, again, I talk about this in a lot of my other videos, but I just want to help re-emphasize this point in every video that I have the chance to do. If you don't have an Amazon listing, the way that you should be thinking about it is that there's always going to be a certain percentage of customers that will see your ad on Facebook, be interested in your product, but then go directly to Amazon because they do 100% of their shop with Amazon as it stands. And if your brand is not there, what it means is probably Chinese resellers that are cannibalizing your listing, or just other competitors there in general that they'll end up buying from that look similar enough to your product, and they trust it enough just from the Amazon listing, if it has decent reviews, to then go and buy from there. So at the minimum, the way you should look at this is you're leaving at least 10% of whatever sales you're doing on the table by not having an Amazon listing in place. And if you have a good Amazon listing in place, this can be all the way upwards of 40% plus that you're leaving out on the table if you were able to optimize it. At bare minimum, this is almost just from having a pretty strong halo effect with the bare minimum advertising effects in place. And this is if you really start to understand all the different levers that you have on Amazon, from different channels that you can optimize, from different media buying outlets, from different places you can advertise and utilize ad spend. This is, and also assuming you have good reviews, you optimize your reviews, you have an optimized listing. This is how you get upwards of this 40% plus that will come on Amazon from whatever sales you do on new acquisition on the front end. At a high level, it's really just continuously going from, first off, if you don't have Amazon, get this so you can get at least to this basis. And then it's continuously figuring out how to move up in this pipeline to get to that 40% plus by continuously optimizing all the different levers. And this is something we're doing across all of our internal brands. It's something we're helping recommend to all of our client brands as well, as a huge lever to just grow further with their brands. Now, the next piece, which kind of applies for all of the above, is just having a proper hiring pipeline, which will help subsidize for all this, right? Because if we go back to the creatives machine, the thing is with the creatives machine is you're starting to scale all the stuff. As you saw, those creative strategist numbers from what we were looking at before, it was like 8 different strategists. And from a video editor standpoint, we're talking about 17 different editors that you need just to get to that type of run rate. And especially if you're now trying to scale to multi-millions per month in spend. Like these numbers just keep growing. So there's different hires that I would call like rolling hires, which are a lot within the creatives team, where these different positions are positions that you continuously need to find more and better talent for, assuming that you also have pretty good trainings in place. So creating the way that you're going to recruit good talent on a consistent basis and a reliable basis becomes extremely important as you start to scale to these types of numbers. So having a hiring pipeline for these different positions, but then there's also like leadership roles as a whole, right? Positions you could think about are like a head of growth, for example, right? This is someone that can centralize your funnel, your creatives, your media buying. So someone there, or a lead media buyer that can actually take on a lot of the ad spend portions, right? Or someone that can be your creatives director. So someone that just can lead the whole creatives department, right? You'll start to realize that you need to centralize these bigger and bigger teams under high lever people that can really manage and have the experience managing this higher growth roles, especially from the marketing side. And this obviously then applies on the backend side, so your operation, your customer service. So this really just doesn't end on this side. And like the bigger your teams grow, the better that you need to be at efficiently finding good talent, convincing good talent to come and work with your company, and keeping good talent in your company. So this is something that can go into depth on a lot more on this. But as a whole, the way that you make all these different pieces work, as you saw, it comes down to how good you are at hiring and how good you are at ultimately recruiting and keeping people in your business. Okay, now points 6 and 7, let me go over these points together, which we can group as just like back-end operations to make all this work. Because what will happen, and this is a funny place to be because it's a cool place to be, but at the same time it sucks, and this is where we're at with a few of the internal brands, is that you'll get to a place where, believe it or not, you just can spend way more than what you're spending. And this can be like literally at 6 figures a day in spend. You'll just feel I can spend way more. And this is when you get the perfect storm of all of these things coming together, right? Like you get to a place where you have very strong MRR in place. You have really efficient subscription numbers. So you know that every time you're acquiring these customers, you're compounding everything in a really positive way. You're at a place where you're at a healthy CAC and you can actually afford to spend way more on CAC than what you're spending at this current rate. You have enough bandwidth to produce the amount of creatives and funnel optimizations that you need. Your Amazon listing is in place and continuously growing. You have the right people in place and you're building out the team. What will end up happening is you're probably going to lead into a bottleneck on one of these standpoints. Either it's from a cash flow perspective or just a back-end perspective, right? Because what you'll get to is a point where the numbers are all going to make sense, but you might not want to scale further, because the further you scale, it means the more inventory that you need to have in advance, the more that you need to be able to keep up with the demand and the operations, the more that you don't want to break your whole infrastructure, right? So a lot of it is just going to come down to your back end being able to support that type of growth. And you're going to get to a place, if you do all these pieces right, where you're going to overscale and your back end is going to break as a result of it. So you have to make sure that you're pacing out your back end with the amount of growth that you're trying to sustain on the front end. And then from a cash flow perspective, a lot of it is, if you do the model that I talk about with my clients, it's always using your MRR, or I'll call it your MRP. So your monthly recurring profit, excuse me. So your MRP is what we can call it. I don't even think that's a term, but we'll just call it for this video. So whatever your MRP is, and let's just call it $1 million a month. The way that I try to look at it is that this is our funding source for the month. So we won't lose more than $1 million a month on customer acquisition. Obviously, assuming that $1 million a month that we're going negative will result in a lot of more MRR coming for the future months. So it's all kind of a flywheel system. So if we lose that $1 million a month, what that means is the next month, it will probably be $2 million that we're making from the MRR standpoint. And we do that all without losing money on the front end, because we're using this as our cushion. This would have to be broken down through some spreadsheets for this to make full sense, but hopefully you guys understand the analogy on what I'm getting at over here. So because of this, we can keep growing with continuous flywheel effect. Now, what we might find out is that we could technically lose, in this first example, maybe 1.5 million over the course of that month, and be able to maybe double the amount of new customers that we bring in, given our target CAC, an example, right? Now, the trade-off is we need to figure out a way to float an additional 500K in cash flow to make that work. And if you get creative with different cash flow solutions, sometimes it will make sense to do. Maybe it's through some form of a loan, which I typically highly advise against. And I've learned the hard way on that, especially with MCA loans, which I can make a whole video on. But if you guys are interested in that, you can comment below and I can make more of an in-depth video on that. But that's another story. But then there's other ways where you can get creative with a Facebook credit line, with better terms with your suppliers, with different things like that, where you can leverage more cash flow. So the thing is, you want to figure out the optimal blend between all of these different things to maximize your cash flow and to optimize your backend. When I talk about the backend, this can be things like payment processors, for example. So even if you're running a completely clean business, which I hope all of you guys, and this is what I encourage all of my viewers to do, you're running clean businesses. But if you're doing that, you still don't want to put all of your eggs in one basket. And for us, we're doing almost all of our sales still with Shopify Payments across multiple brands, but we also are diversifying, creating alternate processors through different funnel flows and things like that, where we can test different things out just to have some diversity, hedge our risk on different things like that. Outside of that, it's also just your logistics process, getting your costs down on product as a whole, optimizing your warehouse. If you're using a 3PL, maybe considering going into your own warehouse. There's just a lot more savings that you can unlock from things like that. So I could talk a lot more on this. Again, like this is mainly my business partner that handles all of these different parts over here. But this is just a huge piece that we're looking at going into 2026 to just be able to continuously scale further. And then the last part on all of this is essentially just repeating all of these different things, right? So once you get this basis of understanding how to do a subscription model in a successful way that works, the numbers work, you understand how to read the numbers, you put the pieces in place to have a creatives machine, a funnel machine, you understand how to optimize your listing on Amazon, you have a way to continuously fill in those positions so you can continuously scale the team members that are needed, and you dial in the back end and the operations. Now that's a point where you want to start launching more products on the front end. So more new offers for new customers to just continuously grow this machine. And as you start to do this, and this is like a big part of our plan for this year, is just SKU expansion. Because once you get all these levers in place, this becomes one of the biggest leverage points that you have in your business, because you can just essentially repeat all these processes for a new product with new needs for new customers that your current core SKU is not delivering on. And if you do it within the same brand, you're adding more brand value, you're adding more MRR, you're adding more multiples on the valuation. There's just a lot of benefits of doing this all within the same brand, and not to mention the cross-selling that can happen on the back end between these different products. So there's just a lot of leverage points that come as a result of all of this. So as a whole, between our portfolio of brands that are now pacing at well above 9 figures per year, and also the different clients that we're working with, this is really the main things that we try to emphasize to the clients that we work with, and try to help plug in the biggest bottlenecks between all these different things within their brands and what we actively are working on within our core internal brand. So if you're a brand that's already doing above $100,000 a month in sales, ideally a little bit more, ideally above $300,000 a month, I would call it as a good basis to really work with us on a one-on-one basis. I would love to potentially work with you. We're limiting the amount of new clients that we take in to around 5 per month. So if you are someone there and you do think that you qualify for that, and you do see how a lot of these things can potentially help you within your business, then do the link down below. If you are a good fit, I'll get on a call with you directly one-on-one to see if you're a good fit. And if you are a good fit, then you're going to work directly with me, my business partners, our actual team directly, and be integrated into our group that on average, the average client right now is doing 1.5 million a month. So I don't think too many groups can say the same on the caliber per client that they're actively in their community or in their group. So if you are someone that is a good fit, I would love to assess it. And if you are a good fit, we're going to help put together the 2026 game plan for you, put all these pieces in place, and hopefully scale you to millions to multi-millions per month in sales. Thank you guys for watching, and comment what type of videos you want to see next.